Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're going behind the lines to consider the oft-overlooked fates of the millions of soldiers on the Eastern Front who fell into enemy hands and became prisoners of war. Millions were killed or died in camps from Germany all the way to Siberia, and many did not make it home until the 1950s. This is their story. Hi Jesse, another week, another podcast. Very good to see and to hear you. So as I've just said, a slightly different topic you might say today, because quite often we and everyone else looking at military history concentrate very much at the sharp end. So looking at the battles, the fighting, the explosions, the guns firing, all that kind of stuff. But quite often, the moment the guns fall silent, we tend to not really look at what happened afterwards. And I think this is fundamentally wrong, because the fates of the prisoners of war is an integral part of the story. And as I've just said, well, for many of them, the experience of captivity, of being a prisoner of war, was actually far longer, far more influential than the time they actually spent in their armies. Because you might perhaps find someone who spent, let's say, a week, a month, or whatever, fighting, and then he gets captured, and then he spends years in a prisoner of war camp. So it's something overlooked, but absolutely essential. How do you see it?
I mean, yeah, it's one of those topics that you're not going to have a computer game made about it. You're not going to have, more than likely, the experience of prisoners of war as the focus for a big budget film or anything like that, because it's perceived as lacking this excitement. But if we put our historian hats on and we're interested in the human experience of war, or we're interested in how, let's say, the politics of war and the ideology of the different regimes expresses itself in different ways, different actions that have an impact on human beings, usually a negative one, looking at prisoners of war is extremely useful for understanding, as I say, not only the lived experience of the millions and millions of people who were prisoners of war, but also what it can tell us about how the war was fought and what people were thinking about how the war should be fought and what they were thinking about the enemy as well. So I think there are a bunch of different things that prisoners of war and their experience can reveal to us about bigger historical questions. But of course, on a human element, it can be extremely compelling as well. So I think we're going to try to chuck in a bunch of those different elements in the course of this episode, and potentially even the next one, because we want to focus today on the Eastern Front. That's where the majority of prisoners of war became prisoners of war. And it's also quite revealing in some of the ways that I just mentioned. So, Matthias, why don't you get the ball rolling for us today?
Well, I think the first one that you said is absolutely essential, is the fact that most of the prisoners were taken on the Eastern Front. And this is why we're opening this debate with the Eastern Front. I can just throw out some numbers here. I don't want to overburden people with numbers, but just to give people an idea, because I think particularly in the West, we have a slightly wrong understanding of what actually happened on the Eastern Front, both when it comes to the fighting, but also when it comes to prisoners of war. I'm just going to throw out one or two numbers here. And this is an official number from April 1944, where the Germans compiled a list of the prisoners that they held. And at that stage, they had about 1.1 million Soviet prisoners of war that they were holding. And we compare this, for example, to the Western Allies. So at the same time, they only held about 21,000 Americans and about 160,000 British. So immediately you can see the Eastern Front, as with everything to do with World War II, that is really, really the big one. We're going to go through the numbers. We're going to analyze them in this episode for the Eastern Front. As you already said, in a subsequent episode, we're going to be talking about the other nations and so the Western Allies, but let's concentrate on the Eastern Front and the Germans and the Soviets there, or I should say the Axis powers rather than the Germans, because of course there were Italians and other troops, Romanians and what have you, involved as well. Before we can actually delve into this and start talking about the fates of the people and what happened to them and why things happened to them, I think it's quite important to go back a little bit, as we always do. So start wide, provide the strategic, the context, the bigger picture stuff before we then zoom in. And I think it's really important to look at the legal status of prisoners of war in that period and that particular time. And in order to do that, we need to go back to before the First World War, because in 1899 and then in 1907, you have the Conventions for Land Warfare of The Hague, which still exist today. And these basically set out how to fight a war, what you're supposed to be doing, what is a war crime, all these things. And they also talk about prisoners of war. The original one, 1899, is relatively short on this, but then the 1907 one goes into much more detail. And it's quite a fascinating read if you're interested in these things, because it really sets out what is a prisoner of war. So you need to be a combatant or non-combatant. So, for example, if you're a medic or if you are a priest in uniform, you would also be treated as a prisoner of war. And also tells you how these people have to be treated. So, for example, you could make people to work. It gets broken down. So officers are not allowed to work unless they really want to. NCOs could be forced in certain instances. Soldiers in the ranks could be made to work. However, they are not allowed to work towards the war effort of the enemy nation. It talks about repatriation. So if you are, for example, wounded and then captured, the idea was that you would get repatriated as quickly as possible. So it's a story that's very often overlooked, but this happened actually in both world wars. So if I go to the First World War, so now moving into the realm of our sister podcast for just 1 second. So one of my family members, he fought at Verdun. He was very badly wounded. And in 1917, via Switzerland, he was repatriated and came back to Germany. The idea, of course, behind that being they're so badly wounded, they will not be able to make a big contribution to the war effort. It talks about accommodation, how they'll be accommodated. All these things are in there. Then after the First World War, they realized, you know what, we need even more, because yes, we protected the prisoners of war, but it didn't really work that well, again, mainly on the Eastern Front. And as a consequence of that, there is a Geneva Convention signed in 1929, which then leads into and links to the Geneva Conventions as we know them, signed after World War II. And this is the Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Now, this period, 1929, is a period of, perhaps you might say, détente. They've understood the horrors of the First World War. There's a lot going on in the international arena. For example, a year before that, you've got the so-called Kellogg-Briand Pact, which for the very, very first time in history outlaws the use of military force or going to war as an accepted political means. So you can see that there are things happening. And this document is really, really fascinating. It's quite long. It's got a number of articles, and they really go into detail as to how prisoners of war have to be treated. Again, they pick up from the 1989-1907 Convention of The Hague, but it gets far more detailed. For example, it even talks about mail that is supposed to be sent. And again, in the Second World War, that happened. So you had a daily mail exchange between, for example, the Germans, not so much with the Eastern Front, but with the Western Allies, and that normally went all via Switzerland. It also talks about the relationship between the captors and the prisoners of war. So, for example, the prisoners of war were supposed to have some sort of council and a representative who would be able to talk to the camp commandant about how to improve the relations, but also the conditions in the camp. It talks about, again, about work, who can you send to work, what are they allowed to do. It even says that if you are told to work for the state that captured you, you should get paid. And the way you should get paid is either your normal wage as a military person that you would get, or actually you should get paid the same amount of money as someone doing that job who's not a prisoner of war. So if you're made to work in a farm, you are supposed to get the same amount as the farmer or the whoever is supporting that particular farmer. So you can see very, very detailed. It's really quite interesting to see how much thought went into this. Now, the big problem that we find when we look at the Eastern Front is that the Soviet Union did not sign this 1929 agreement. And that was always used by the Germans to then say all these conventions, they do not apply, which technically is wrong because the convention quite clearly states that even if one side signs it, both sides need to adhere to it. But they conveniently forgot about this and overlooked this because it fitted in quite nicely with the German idea of war in the East, extermination, subhumans, the Soviet soldiers, and all these things. So very interesting to look at the legal framework and see how this was adhered to or not adhered to. And when you look at the German side again, for example, you have a very, you might say, detailed structure there as well of an organization that looks after prisoners of war. And it's basically cut into two parts. You've got one, it's a full colonel, and he's responsible for all of the prisoners of war inside in Germany and the occupied territories. And he answers straight to the OKW, so the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. But then you also have a second structure, and that is the so-called Generalquartiermeister. Yes, it is one word, obviously, because it is German. And he's responsible for looking after the prisoners of war in the combat zone. So you can see a lot of thought is going into it, and it's quite a big machine, and we can unpick that as we go through.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how the political imperative, and standing behind that, of course, is the ideological imperative, just makes a mockery of any agreements on paper if it wants to, right?
Doesn't that sound familiar?
These agreements that we have, whatever international law or conventions, they only matter, they can only be applied if there is a will to do it from the people who are in positions of power. And of course, in this case, for the Germans, there is the will to not apply them. It's not just, we're not going to bother with them, it's we're going to do the exact opposite of what the spirit and letter of these conventions are, regardless of the pretext that the Soviet Union was an international pariah and didn't sign some of those conventions and so on and so forth. And of course, this comes through with orders like the famous or infamous Kommissarbefehl, which is before Operation Barbarossa. There's this order that goes out to the German army. Basically, the Commissar, of course, is a political officer from the Soviet Communist Party that's in units to make sure that ideologically they're motivated, that they're kind of essentially there to ensure ideological conformity and so on, and discipline, and in the eyes of the Communist Party, how that should work, and so on and so forth. So they are to be shot out of hand if they fall into German hands. That's the idea behind this Kommissarbefehl, Commissar order. So right away, you can see the impact of this desire for what the Germans call a Vernichtungskrieg, right? So a war of total destruction, basically. So if that's your ideology, it's going to play itself out regardless of what conventions there are. And when Barbarossa gets going, and now, Matthias, you might want to backtrack if you've got a couple of observations about that, but I just want to start getting into the scale to set the table here. You mentioned that in 1944, the Germans surveyed, they were holding 1.1 million living Soviet prisoners. That's very important to mention, living, because of course they captured many, many, many times that over the course of the whole war. 5.7 million Soviet soldiers fell into German hands. Many of those in the first period of the war. You have these huge battles of encirclement. Kiev is a famous one. There was one also in Belarus, around Minsk and so on. And you're capturing hundreds of thousands at once. And this creates an opportunity for you to act on, if you're the Germans, to act on your ideological convictions. It also creates logistical problems, but I think we'll get into how that's been used as an excuse later in this episode. But just to give just another figure that I thought was interesting before I throw it back to you. In the first 8 months of the war, the Germans capture 3.5 million Soviet prisoners. I mean, this is like insane numbers, unheard of numbers before or since. Yes, they captured a lot of Russian Empire prisoners in 1915, especially nearly 1 million in that year in the First World War, but never 3.5 million people have been captured in the course of 8 months. When the war is still going, you might capture them if one side completely surrenders. So we're talking unheard of scale. Before we get into more of the details of what happens with those men and how they're treated and so on, what do you want to add to where I've gotten us to so far here?
you mentioned, I think the numbers are just absolutely staggering. And again, we need to understand that this is warfare at a completely different scale, a scale that it's very, very difficult to fathom, to understand, and to really get to grips with. So the numbers are just absolutely crazy. You mentioned some of these pockets. I mean, Kiev, you mentioned it, is the largest pocket on the Eastern Front. Of course, the figures always go up and down a little bit, but roughly speaking, 650,000 Soviet prisoners are taken by the Germans. This is a huge number. And then, of course, the question is what do you do with them? And it is interesting when you then listen to the accounts from the people on the ground. The Germans were saying, well, you know what? We didn't expect that. We didn't know what to do with them. There were so many. We were not prepared for this. So basically, we didn't have any provisions. And again, we get into more detail of what that really means. But a lot of them basically just died because the system was overwhelmed. If you give them the benefit of the doubt, and that's a big if, I would say that the troops on the ground, they might feel like this in 1941. However, when you take a step back again and look at ideology, look at the ideas of German policy, I think you can't really uphold the statement, because the idea that the Germans had was very, very clear. They wanted to gain Lebensraum, living space in the East. And of course, the last thing you want to have is when you want to gain living space is that you want to have, as they would call it, useless eaters in that area. It all goes back, again, we're talking about a lot of the First World War in this episode already. So the British blockade, you need to become independent of food supplies, of external food supplies. So why not go, for example, into the Ukraine and use this basket of Europe, like they had tried at the end of the First World War, to sustain Germany and friendly territory. So that's the idea. And as a consequence of that, even before Barbarossa starts, you talked about the Kommissarbefehl. There are lots of other ones that talk about the treatment of Soviet prisoners. One opens up by saying, well, the Soviet soldier is no comrade. And that word comrade in German is quite strong. So everyone, not only a German soldier, but other ones as well, everyone in uniform is a comrade. That does not apply to the Soviet soldier. Because, as the order says, for the first time, you don't have only two nations going to war against each other, but two ideologies. So immediately, this has been pushed into the throats of the German soldiers, how to behave. But it also has implications, of course, for the bigger picture. So before Barbarossa starts, the Minister for Agriculture puts together a memorandum, a plan, and that becomes known colloquially as the Hunger Plan. Because there they state exactly this. So you've got all these people living there. Since the First World War, more people have moved into the cities, into Leningrad, as was called in those days, St. Petersburg, modern St. Petersburg, or Moscow. These are not very productive. They're not producing food stuff. So basically, they should all just disappear. And when you read that particular memorandum of the Hunger Plan, it states that probably between 20 and 30 million people will perish. And that means they'll be starved to death. And that's mainly civilians. But of course, it also applies to the military people. Why would you want to feed these guys if you want to get rid of them? Because you want to get that area for your own settlers so they can produce foodstuff for Germany and other nations, friendly nations, as the war's still ongoing. So you can see right from the beginning, this was very, very much factored in. And this is where you end up with, as you said, so over 5 million the Germans captured, the very, very vast majority, of course, in the early stage, as you already said. So let's say in the first year, perhaps even less than that, probably some of 1941, all the way going up to the autumn of 1941. And of these 5 roughly speaking, 6 to 7 million, the vast majority of them basically are starved to death and they die. And most of them die in the first year. Because it's also very interesting to see that as the war then progresses and Germany's on the defensive, they don't take that many prisoners anymore. And by that stage, they've realized that they can use these guys to work in factories, to work back home, to produce foodstuff, to release Germans to serve in the military. And that's another very interesting factor that's very often overlooked, the influx of foreign workers into Germany, mainly, not exclusive, but mainly as prisoners of war. You could go anywhere in Germany between 1941 and 1945 and just basically be surrounded by foreign languages because these are all these foreign workers. And what you then find is also this whole question, this interesting debate about where they're supposed to be working. Because the conventions made very, very clear that these guys are not supposed to be working in armaments factories. That was forbidden. But the Germans saying, well, the Soviets hadn't signed this, so yes, they can work there. They also put them in mines, for example. They quite often had to clear up for the damages and destruction after Allied bombing raids. So they were used for that because that was very dangerous, because lots of unexploded ordnance might go off. So they were normally put into the most dangerous places. Different with Western allies. You have the same. We're talking about the Eastern Front, which of course means we're very much concentrating on the Soviet Union. But there's another part of the Eastern Front, that's Poland. So that's, in inverted commas, only 1939 where the action takes place, but you still have a lot of Polish soldiers captured by the Germans and held by the Germans till the end of the war. And the legal argument there by the Germans was, well, Poland doesn't exist anymore as a state. So all these treaties that they signed, they don't apply because the state doesn't exist. So we can basically, in inverted commas, do with these prisoners what we want. So again, it's very interesting, as you said earlier. The treaties are just worth the paper they're written on, or not, and they just basically bent the rules as they saw fit. And without the influx of all these people working in agriculture, in industry, and other places, the German war industry would have collapsed much, much earlier.
No question about that. I mean, that's why they shifted their policy when they realized, as you said, that maybe we're not going to be able to defeat the Soviet Union in 6 weeks. Maybe we're going to need to mobilize even more German workers, and we're going to have to replace them somehow if we want to continue fighting this war. On the topic of the logistics of it, so how could the Germans be so unprepared? To what extent can it be argued that that explains some of the deaths and so on? I mean, I'm fully with you. I think that if your stated policy is you want to kill tens of millions of people that you think are lesser humans than you, that is a decision that's going to spill out into how you treat the prisoners of war, no matter what logistical preparations have or have not been made. But given that the Germans just defeated the French the year before, when France surrendered, 1.6 million Frenchmen became prisoners of war in Germany. 2/3 of them did not die of starvation because of logistical problems. So the Germans managed that and were able to do that. So if their expectation or their hope was, we're going to defeat the Soviet Union in 6 weeks, now naturally there's a denser amount of resources in Western Europe and a denser food production and so on. But where I'm going with this is, if you expect to defeat the Soviet Union in 6 weeks, you have to expect that a very, very, very large number of prisoners are going to fall into your hands. And obviously, they didn't prepare for that. And there's a reason for that. And it's the ideology, it's the attitude that we've been talking about. I also think that these different Kommissarbefehle, orders to kill, like extrajudicial executions, basically, and this not recognizing the existence of another state, this kind of takes off, war is a dangerous thing. War is about violence. You are saying, we're going to unleash the ability to kill other people. The trick is, if you're going to do that, it's a very slippery slope. You need to have a lot of strong safeguards in place to not let that Pandora's box get out of hand. This is why you have strict discipline in militaries over the years, sometimes even very, very harsh discipline in militaries over the years, because when you have a group of people who have weapons, who have power, who are allowed to kill, it's human that it's going to get out of hand. And so, as sad as that is, it's part of human nature. It's going to get out of hand unless you really have safeguards. Those are things like recognizing the need for discipline, recognizing the need to work with other groups of people in a kind of political structure that we all accept. It's been countries, essentially, since the 17th century. So if you don't recognize that a country exists, and you think that its inhabitants are less than human, it's a recipe for absolute destruction, which is, of course, what the purpose was as well. Just to tag on a couple of additional numbers, I'm trying to string the numbers out. It's just the numbers are really important, I think, to grasping what's going on here. You mentioned, the first year and so on. In the first 8 months, that's the stat that I found, the Germans take 3.5 million Soviet prisoners in the first 8 months. Of those, 2.8 million die. So this is an absolute, I don't even know what the word is, like a Massensterben is the German, like mass die off, kill off, if you will, of those Soviet prisoners in the first year. In total, about nearly 60% of the Soviet prisoners taken by the Germans die/are killed during the war. That's about 3.3 million who are killed and die of the 5.7 million. But look at that. In the first 8 months, 2.8 million of them die. How can you kill that many people at once? Well, basically, they shot a whole bunch out of hand, commissars and Jewish soldiers in the Red Army. Doesn't matter what rank you were, what role you played. If you're a Jewish commissar, you're getting shot. If you're a Jewish private who's been mobilized, they're going to shoot you as well. So that accounts for 250, 300,000 or so in 1941. But they keep them in open fields, basically, surrounded by barbed wire. And they don't feed them enough. They don't give them water. So you have people dying of exposure, dying of thirst, dying of diseases, of course, because there's no sanitation. You're just in a barbed wire enclosure with nothing, trying to scrape holes in the earth for water, for latrines, for sleeping, and so on. People turned to cannibalism in those cases. Sometimes the Germans shot them for sport across the barbed wire, etc., etc. So this, on a mass scale, is what causes these 2.8 million deaths in the first. And then, of course, it gets colder over the winter, and then you have lots of people dying of hypothermia or freezing to death. There's a scene, we talked in a previous episode about movies, and we talked about this Soviet film, Come and See. They feature this in the movie. There's a scene where there's a camp in a forest, in this case, and the German officer tosses some beets, I think it was, over the wire, and then the prisoners are just tearing at each other and fighting over these few beets that have been tossed in. It's a completely inhuman situation. I even read an account they tossed in a dead dog somewhere. A German was writing, having witnessed this. And the same kind of scene repeats itself. So you think these people are less than human, and then you make them dehumanize themselves by the way that you treat them, which then, paradoxically, confirms your previous assumption that they're not as human as you. So that's kind of a big part of the story of what's going on in that first phase when the dying reaches its peak as far as Soviet powers are concerned.
No, that's exactly it. And you've just said everything. It's this part of the ideology. So we don't want these people and they should just perish and die. And of course, for the Germans back home, in inverted commas, the good thing was that at this particular stage, this all happens very, very far over there in the East. So this whole argument of we didn't know anything about this, you might argue, at least to a degree, perhaps, that could still be upheld. That was no longer the case when we move to the next phase, where they do things very, very differently. But as you said, these numbers are absolutely staggering. And people have made the argument, if the Holocaust hadn't been part of this period, the killing of the Soviet prisoners of war would have been one of the worst atrocities in human history. And that is very, very true. And in a way, it's also quite shocking that it is completely overlooked. No one really ever talks about this. Yes, people died and people get taken prisoner, but I wouldn't say it's written out of history. I think that would be too strong a term, but it's nothing that people really engage with or look at. In Germany itself, now it's a little bit different. You had a number of triggers for this. So, for example, the famous Wehrmachtsausstellung, so the Wehrmacht exhibition, which was about killing prisoners of war and also taking part in the Holocaust. That caused a big debate within Germany. And even German parliament only a few years ago acknowledged let's call it the National Guild here. And they decided to pay some money to the survivors. But I mean, how many survivors do you have? Because you just gave the numbers. Most of them died anyway. And this is now 80 years on. So a few thousand people in Russia, probably still today, regardless of what's happening in the world at this particular moment, are still receiving some money as compensation, you might say, from the German government. But how and what does that help? So the fate of the Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front is one that's been, as I said, I wouldn't say written out of history, but neglected. It's definitely been neglected, and that's really, really sad.
A relative of mine, by marriage, not by blood, received some compensation, I think in the mid-2000s. It was enough to get a new TV in Ukraine. So 3 years of slave labor versus a new TV when you're in your 80s. So it's obviously impossible to compensate. Some compensation is better than none. I think that's clear. But yes, to your point about the change in policy, I think that's quite significant. That then after 1942, only in very much quotation marks, inverted commas, whatever, only 500,000 Soviet prisoners of war in German hands die from mid-1942 onwards. So that's still a colossal number of people. Many of them were worked to death or not given proper treatment for diseases that they contracted, of course, in camps and so on and so forth. But that shows that the Germans are trying to get what they can out of them and improve their treatment of them, not because they suddenly became nice guys and adopted a different ideology, but purely for pragmatic purposes of improving what use they could get out of these forced laborers.
And as we already discussed, perhaps the main point is to keep the German war economy going. So they suddenly realize, well, we're running out of manpower, we're falling behind, we need to get the army stronger and stronger and bigger, because Germany is fighting more and more enemies. So where do you get these guys from? Well, you need to get them from normal society, but that means you can't have these factory workers anymore because they don't need to serve in the army. That's the problem you find in every single country when war goes on. You've got exactly the same debate, for example, in Britain, if you want to switch to the West for a brief moment. The manpower crisis in the British Army is to a large degree caused by the fact they said, we need to have lots of people in industry working in the mines, all these things. So we can't put them in uniform. Whereas the Germans tried to solve this particular problem by getting these foreign workers, as they call them, Fremdarbeiter, in. And again, the numbers are absolutely staggering. So when you look at, which was probably the largest so-called Russenlager, so Russian camp, that was based in a place called Hema. No one of your listeners will know where that is unless you've served in the British Army, because there was a very big British garrison there up to the 1990s, I think. So there was a barracks there, and these barracks were then used as this Russian camp. And because this is on the outskirts, the eastern end of the Ruhr area. So that was the main camp there. And under this camp, you had 100,000 Russian, or Soviet, we should say, prisoners of war. And they were sent into the factories, they were sent into the mines. And as I said, as the bombing war increases, they're also used to clear up the rubble. And quite a lot of them get blown up by unexploded ordnance and these things. So the numbers, again, are very, very big. And this is also one of these camps which colloquially, internally in Germany, became known as one of the death camps. Because people, well, yes, they made them work and they wanted to preserve the workforce. That's the only thing they cared about. But still, lots of people die. It's also neat to see how it shifts, because they tried to keep the Soviet prisoners of war away to a large degree from the Western ones. So again, that the stories wouldn't get out and all these things. So you can see it's even in those days, the second part of the war, when we say, well, things have changed, it is still pretty nasty.
No question about that. I mean, I live in Austria. Probably, I think the largest concentration camp in Austria is called Mauthausen. I've been there a couple of times. I took students there, for example. And it's amazing, some of the stories that come out of there. There were many Soviet prisoners of war who were sent there to work in the quarry there. And they kept the dying ones, who they weren't going to treat, in a barbed wire, fenced-off area outside the main camp, in full view of people from the village, because the village soccer pitch was next to it. So you'd have regional league games, people would come and watch, cheer on the team, whatever. And on the other side of the pitch, a little ways, you could see Soviet prisoners of war starving to death, dying of typhus and so on, corpses lying there. Completely insane. But this was the reality of the situation with Soviet prisoners of war. They being the Germans, of course, experimented with some techniques for the Holocaust. You mentioned the Holocaust. There is a link, because when the Germans started to experiment, how can we gas, larger numbers of people? They didn't just all of a sudden have giant gas chambers at the killing centers of Treblinka or Auschwitz or whatever. They started smaller scale, and very often the victims of these experiments were Soviet prisoners of war, because they don't matter. They're not human. We can test this gas van, as they originally had in the earlier phases, on these Soviet prisoners, and so on and so forth. Some Soviet prisoners tried to get themselves out of this situation, of course. It was easier for non-Slavs, because the Germans did, later in the war, set up some legions for like Turkmen and Georgians and Azerbaijanis and some Baltic people as well. So there's like a slight margin of maneuver for some of the Soviet prisoners, but obviously not for the vast majority. Some became what the Germans called Hiwis also, which is a Hilfswilliger, so basically like an assistant to the armed forces who's not fighting. And that's a way that a Soviet prisoner could improve their situation. Matthias, I see you wanting to add something about the Hiwis, the helpers.
You basically just mentioned what I wanted to say. That's absolutely true. So
great minds think alike.
There we go. No, the Hiwis are absolutely important, and they're also important to keep the German army running. When you look at it, I mean, it's very difficult to find proper statistics on that, But when you read the accounts, you can get a feel, an idea for how many of these were actually using. So normally within a company, so that's about 120 men, it was not unusual to have about an extra 10% or so 12, 15 people working as heavies. So there was a lot of these people. For exactly the reasons you mentioned. It's not because they want to fight for or support the German war cause, but because that was their ticket out of the prisoner of war camp. And of course, you also mentioned these other troops, the Azerbaijanians, and all these other contingents that you have. If, again, we switch very briefly again to the Western Front, you can see them being used in uniform as well. So we made one episode about Operation Dragoon. They are there. You have them fighting in Normandy in the very early phases. And again, just think about what this really means, how desperate the Germans must be as well at that particular stage. So we're now looking at the second part of the war, of course. So you've got someone from Azerbaijan dressed in a German uniform, fighting against the British and Americans in France for Germany. I mean, just think about what that really means, and the combat value as well, which of course is extremely low. So all sorts of really interesting facets. And you can't blame these people because they are trying to get out. But of course, that would then have repercussions for them after the war as well, things we're not going to go into right now.
What should we go into right now? Do we want to do the flip side and talk about Germans in Soviet captivity?
I think that might be a very good idea, yes.
All right. Well, then let's lean into it.
It doesn't get any more lighthearted, unfortunately. But,
I'm afraid not. We are plumbing the depths of human history, dear listeners, which is useful, I have to say.
Or maybe before we switch to the other big part, which is, of course, the Germans. And so we got these two nations fighting it out. Again, it might perhaps be very good to very, very briefly look at other contingents. And again, it's the Poles that spring to mind. And Poland really, really has had an extremely hard time in the 20th century, particularly in World War II. So the country divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Germans treating the Polish prisoners of war also very, very badly. Not as badly, you might say, as perhaps as the Soviets, but also very badly. Lots of them die. You don't really want to be a Polish prisoner of war in Germany unless you can really not avoid it. But it's the same if you look at the other side. So if you're a Polish prisoner of war captured by the Soviets, the numbers are much, much lower because they get engaged in 1939 later. The areas that they occupy are not as densely populated. But when you just look at the casualty rates of the Poles that get killed, executed, left to die by the Soviets are actually higher as a percentage of the Soviets that die in German captivity. So again, the numbers are absolutely staggering, or in particular the percentages. And of course, the famous example here that everyone mentions when you talk about this one example that people know is the massacre at Katyn. This is where the Soviets get together the Polish intelligentsia, so the educated classes and officers, and basically do a mass shooting. The figures differ a little bit, but somewhere in the region of 20,000 Poles get executed by the Soviets. And the story behind it is also very interesting because in 1943, the Germans find this mass grave. And they dig up the bodies and they present it to the world. And you see, this is why we need to fight against the Soviets. Look at how inhumane and awful these people are. The Soviets, of course, say, well, that wasn't us, that was the Germans. The Polish government in exile then gets involved and says, we would like you, as the Soviets, to investigate this and basically look into this. We also would like to have the Red Cross to go there and have a look at it to see what's happening. The Soviets say, no, you know what, that's not happening. They cut all ties with the Polish exile government. They do not let the Red Cross in. So the official party line in the Soviet Union and the entire Eastern Bloc up to the 1990s was that was a massacre executed by the Germans. It's only when Gorbachev takes over that he actually admits and says, you know what, that happened. And by the way, there were more of these. There are other examples as well where the Germans advance into what's then the Soviet Union, so the former parts of Poland in 1941. Brest is an interesting example where they find lots of shot Poles shot by the Soviets in the cellar. So that's also another story that I think not in Poland itself, but in the rest of the world quite often overlooked. So even there, the behavior is pretty nasty. So again, just because we're talking about the Eastern Front, I think it's always quite good not to only look at the Germans and the Soviets because other nations are suffering as well. But maybe we switch to the Germans now because that's the other big block, I would say. what do we have to say about the Germans and Russian captivity, or Soviet? I keep saying Russian, it should be Soviet.
Yes, let's turn our attention to, as we like to do, to uphold the branding and spirit behind this podcast. We're going to look at both sides of the wire, unfortunately, literally the wire in this case. And now we'll talk a bit about German and Axis prisoners in Soviet hands, of whom there were very many, especially as of 1942, when the war, of course, shifts direction on the Eastern Front. And again, I will try to start us off with a couple of numbers. In total, over the course of the war, the Soviets take about 3.1 million Germans prisoner. Of course, the estimates vary. Is it 3 million? Is it 3.2 million? Let's call it 3.1 for the purposes of today, of whom, because this unfortunately is also the theme for today, of whom something like 1.1 million die in captivity in Soviet hands. So that's about a third as a death rate, which is unbelievably high and represents, neglect and other crimes on the part of the Soviet authorities. But it's a heck of a lot lower than 60%, which is the death rate of Soviets in German hands. So I wanted to throw that out there to get us started on the other side of the hill, Matthias, and I'll let you take it from there.
So you've already given the numbers. So again, it's staggering. It's mind blowing. Just like the other side that we just looked at. Again, this concept that I keep banging on about, warfare, a completely different scale, which is very, very difficult to understand. It's basically the reverse of what you see in the Soviet camps. The Germans capture the vast majority of these prisoners in the early stages of the war. With the Soviets, it's the other way around. So the first time that the Soviets really get their hands on a large number of German prisoners of war is really in late 1942, early 1943. I'm thinking in particular the surrender of the 6th Army at Stalingrad. Before that, the numbers are quite low, and then they go up. When you have these big battles, and Germany is now on the defensive, so the Soviets are normally attacking, which means the attacker tends to take more prisoners. And of course, these numbers go up and up and up. And the vast majority of these, over 3 million that you just mentioned, are captured in 1944, 1945. So in inverted commas, the advantage that they have is that they don't spend that much time in the prisoner of war camps. So that's probably one of the reasons why the numbers are quite a bit lower when you look at the mortality rate here. Of course, there are also other factors that make the whole thing quite, let's just use the term nasty if you want. For example, it is the fact that a lot of these Germans that are captured, and again, I'm thinking of the prime example that everybody thinks of when you talk about German prisoners captured, that's Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad.
They're at death's door already.
And that's exactly the point. So it's really interesting that of these, roughly speaking, somewhere in the region of 250,000 soldiers that are in the pocket, about 90,000. That's not only Germans, by the way. We tend to get this wrong again, because again, the Eastern Front is not only a German war. From 1943 onwards, about 40% of the troops fighting with Germany against the Soviet Union are non-German. So we tend to overlook this. The numbers are not that high in Stalingrad, but you've got other troops, particularly Romanians, that are captured. Of these 90,000 that go into captivity, within the next 2 or 3 months, about 90% die. And of these people captured there, only about 5,000 return, most of them in the early and the mid-50s. So going back to this, what I said earlier, imagine you're a German conscript and you're sent to the Eastern Front after your basic training. You spend perhaps, let's be generous, a year in uniform, and then you spend the next 12 years in a prisoner of war camp. So again, this whole concept of being a prisoner of war and how this was actually, to many of them, more important than the experience of the time in the military itself. It's, again, something that's overlooked. But what's absolutely striking when you look at this, first of all, looking at the statistics, so the mortality rate is extremely high. If you manage to survive the first few months, your chances of survival were actually comparatively, I mean, that we always have to compare it, comparatively high. And the reason for that is, as you just said, these guys have been so malnourished, they're basically dying anyway. And you got these accounts from the Germans, which are absolutely fascinating. They said sometimes we're marched out of Stalingrad towards the train station. These might have been 50, 100 kilometers away, through 2-3 meters of snow. These guys are exhausted, tired. They can't function anymore. What do? You just sit down. And what happens then, of course, is they get shot by the Soviets. And it's really fascinating. When you read all these accounts from the Germans, there's not a single bad word about the Soviets doing that, because what else could they have done? Sometimes you had 1 or 2 Soviet guards per, let's say, 100 or perhaps even more, perhaps 1,000 German prisoners of war. They said they simply couldn't take care of these guys anymore. So they just had to get shot. And that was just the way it was. If you manage to get into one of the proper camps, particularly as the war continues, particularly as it's very obvious that the Soviet Union and the Allies are going to win the war and Stalin wants to win over the Germans, the conditions improve. I mean, it's still all very, very basic, but they do improve. So you have to say that. What's also very interesting is when you look at the different treatment of, for example, officers, which is fascinating. When you look at this is the Soviet Union, a communist state, shouldn't they all be treated the same? No, not at all. After the Battle of Stalingrad, there is an exchange of words between a German officer and a German general, actually, and the Soviets. He said, why are you still here? And he said, well, of course I'm here. I'm here with my troops. If they surrender, I surrender. That's very silly. We would never have done that. We would have flown you out. That's the first thing we would have done because you're so much worse than all these other people because you're a general. It's really fascinating when you look at this. But what I said is also interesting that you don't hear really bad words from the German side about how the Soviets treated them. I mean, there are lots of other very, very nasty episodes. I'm sticking now with Stalingrad because the famous example where the Germans surrender and the Soviets get into the cellars of the first aid post. The biggest one is in the theater at Stalingrad. There are about 2,500 wounded prisoners in there, and they basically just shoot them all, or basically they take the flamethrowers to burn the whole thing out. And the Germans said, what else could they have done? So it's also interesting to see what the human mind basically does, and war does to a human mind. You know what? That's what happens. There was also another saying in the German army, the last comrade, and again, this word Kamerad in German is a very, very, very strong term. The last comrade died at Stalingrad. So after that, it was all for themselves, and you just try to survive. And again, the stories that you read from the prisoners of war camp are absolutely, absolutely gruesome. Also, where they're just trying to survive and, in inverted commas, backstabbing each other. These things also happen. As the situation improves, it gets much better. But to begin with, it is quite nasty as well.
Yeah, and I think there's also a difference to be made in general with the Soviet approach to German prisoners. Obviously, they, as you mentioned, executed wounded, and so on under different circumstances. And of course, they had very, very violent and aggressive propaganda lines about every German should be killed and so on and so forth. Now, one can criticize the Soviet Union till the end of time, obviously, for all of its crimes and moral reprehensibility in different ways. But their ideology was not, the Germans are not humans and we want to eliminate them. And that goes a long way towards explaining the difference in behavior between the Germans and the Soviets, and the difference in outcome of a 60% death rate versus a 33% death rate, both of which are terrible. I am not trying to defend a 33% death rate among prisoners of war when over a million die in captivity. But there is, I think, a kind of underlying substantial difference that we shouldn't forget here. We also shouldn't forget the Italians. And I just wanted to I forgot to mention it before, about 50,000 Italians were taken prisoner by the Red Army, and about half of them died. So that's a much smaller sample size, but they're not getting off any lighter than the Germans, for example.
No, absolutely right. And of course, we mentioned you've got Romanians as well, you've got Hungarians, you've got lots of other groups. You can look at the guys from the Baltic states who, similar to Poland, had a very bad fate in the 20th century. And if you volunteer to fight in the Waffen-SS, because that's where most of them would have ended up, and then you get captured by the Soviets, you can imagine what your fate is then. So that's, again, we mustn't forget these. We keep concentrating on the Soviets and the Germans because these two are the biggest blocks, obviously, but there's so much more happening and so many other countries being involved. This is, again, not for this episode, but this whole idea of the fight of Europe against Bolshevism, as the Germans sold it to Europe, was actually far more, if that's the right word, attractive to lots of European individuals and nations than, of course, people would admit to after 1945. I think that's absolutely right. And I think what you also said is very, very, very important. Absolutely right. It's this whole question of ideology. Whereas the Germans just wanted to kill all of these because they wanted to have the living space, the Soviets do it slightly differently. This is where communism comes in. So it's more about class than about state. And it's fascinating. I mean, you know this area very well. I've been to Russia a number of times. And I always found it very interesting, talking to veterans. They never had a bad word about the Germans. And they made a very, very clear distinction between the Nazis and Germany. I found it very striking. In a way, you might perhaps even say also very generous when you know what the Germans actually did there. All pretty awful. And the fact that they not even forgave, but say, well, that wasn't you, that was just them. Of course, there's politics involved. You go into Cold War politics and how it was all shaped. But at the lower level, talking to individuals, it's interesting that you don't find more resentment. And that, as I said, even talking to the older generation who were there and who saw all this and experienced it, I think that is, I think generous is probably the right word for this.
I'd agree. And I've had a few anecdotal experiences that are similar to that. I can't say that I've read a bunch of scientific studies about Soviet memory and current day attitudes towards it and so on and so forth. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But anecdotally, I've also been surprised by those kinds of scenarios. I think another relevant factor before we start to wind down our discussion about the German experience as prisoners of war or Axis experience is that experience didn't end when the war ended, as you mentioned, right? Some of them were only released in the mid-1950s. And the reasoning behind that on the Soviet side is, well, we need them for work. We need them for labor to help us rebuild our country, half of which has been completely destroyed. And, 27 million Soviet citizens are not there anymore. That's a lot of labor force that you don't have to rebuild your ruined country. And so that's the logic on the Soviet side to keeping these guys until, I think the last ones came back in 1956. If memory serves. I just read an account from an older Austrian woman a couple of days ago who was saying every time there was a big group coming back by train, my mother and I would go down to the train station in case my father was there. And they did this basically for 10 years and he was never there. So he is one of those 1.1 million who died somewhere at some forced labor camp, gulag in Siberia or what have you. I also... One time when I first moved to Berlin, I lived there for one summer, long time ago, to try to start learning German. And after German class, I would go to a supermarket which had a little deli stand where you could buy, what else? Sausages, hot sausages, and eat them right there on these little tables. And I sat down at my table, I'm eating my sausage, contemplating whatever aspects of ridiculous German grammar and case declination that we'd studied that day. And a very elderly couple asks if they can sit with me because there's not a lot of space. And we chatted a little bit. The guy was definitely well into his 80s. And I forget how, but the topic came up of traveling. And he said, well, I've been to Siberia. And I don't know why, but I didn't click right away. I was like, oh, well, did you go there for work? Thinking, because I was thinking, he was from East Germany and as a technician or something went to the Soviet Union to do. And he was sort of like, no.
A different trip.
No.
Yeah, it was a different trip.
Different type of work. And then he didn't elaborate. And I never asked. I didn't want to push it. You never know what kind of stories lie behind that. But so there are these little insights into these kind of extremely dramatic, almost unimaginable human experiences on both the Soviet and the German sides, of course.
Again, you mentioned it. It's all about rebuilding the country. I mean, you have got the same in the West, particularly in France. We'll talk about this in a different episode. But when you fast forward a bit after 1945, I mean, again, there are very nasty stories where these young Hitler Youth guys fighting the streets of Berlin, just running around in their uniform, just get called off the street and then don't come home for the next 3 or 4 years, or no one know where they are. So that kind of stuff. So arresting 14, 15-year-old boys and putting them somewhere in a camp and no one knows what's happening to them. And all of these stories you get. What you then find is in 1947, so that's 2 years after the war was over, there was a conference in Moscow, and that's the Foreign Minister Conference. And it's all to do with the post-war order and these things. It basically fails utterly because you can see it's the beginning of the Cold War. But one aspect of that was the question of releasing the prisoners of war. The Western Allies said we should release them. Even that, by the way, took quite a bit longer. So it's not like in the West, it was all very, very different. So they keep them for quite some time as well. But the Soviets say, well, we still have at that stage around 900,000 German prisoners still in the Soviet Union or controlled by the Soviet Union. And so they said since 1945, about 1 million of them have been released. So 1 million have been released and still about 900,000 in captivity. And they say, okay, if you want to release all of these guys, the prisoners of war, we still need them. And they come up with, you might say it's quite perfidious. They say in that case, we're going to release quite a few of those. So for example, in the next 2 years, they release about half of them. Most of the other ones, not all of them, they're different categories, what have you, but quite a few of them are then put on trial and are then told that they're war criminals, and that means 25 years hard labor. So you can see there's an instant mechanism. And again, well, another family story. So one, it was my great uncle. So he was captured at the Battle of Kursk. And he was one of those who came back in the early 1950s. He had to rebuild Stalingrad. So I remember sitting down and watching a documentary. He said, I know that building because I built it in 1950. Oh, it's still standing. So there we go. German quality. Vorsprung durch Technik, he said. It was quite funny, actually, in a way. And then he was sent back home because he was ill. So probably, I'm not quite sure, but so the symptoms, whether it was probably dysentery. And he said, well, that was the stage when they're trying to release people because they were not really looking after them. Sometimes became more of a burden for the Soviet system as well. At that stage, you couldn't just kill them or let them die. So you need to give them proper provisions and medical care. So sometimes, if they're too ill, just send them back. And he said the way to look at this was to basically get them undressed. And then they looked at the butt cheeks. If these were hanging down because we're so weak and thin that they were hanging down, that was the first tick in the box. And then they would grab your cheeks. And if they could, between your two fingers, turn the entire cheek around because it was just the skin hanging off, that was the sign to get released. And he was sent back. And I still, right next to me, I still got his uniform. It's in my cupboard here that he was wearing when he came back. I outgrew that when I was 13. I hope it's okay to say I'm not the biggest person out there in the world, but I outgrew that when I was 13. So it again tells you a little bit about the conditions that they were facing even in those days. And the other ones just stay there and they continue to do whatever they need to do and rebuild things and work in mines or what have you. And that was a very, very big political drive, of course, in Germany, particularly in West Germany, not so much East Germany, because they said, well, these are all criminals or they would have been released because, well, the Soviet Union is our friend, so they wouldn't do anything wrong. But in West Germany, there was this big, big drive to get them back. Of course, West Germany was not, Germany on the whole, whichever way you look at it, they were not sovereign states at the time, so they couldn't really do anything. But there was a very, very big movement from the population. So, for example, you had a day of the prisoners of war where everybody would put candles in the windows to remember. And you already mentioned these trains coming back. In the German case, they would get to a camp which is called Friedland, and that's where they would arrive, and then they would be distributed and being sent home. And again, the same story. So people going there, trying to find out what happened to them. You had newspapers for years and years and years where they say, well, my husband went missing. Anyone know? Please get in touch. And so the German official system that looked into this and tried to find the prisoners of war or find out their fate at least. Are they still alive? Have they been killed? Only closed down a few years ago. Up to that, it was still going. You could still write to them and say, well, my father, grandfather, great-grandfather went missing here and there. Do you know anything about him? Now they say, well, everyone who's not been found, obviously, they're now dead in whatever shape or form. And so there's no point in continuing with this. But that's how long it went on for. And then, of course, you have the very, very famous episode where the Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, flies to Moscow to talk about big political stuff. Again, it's the beginning of the Cold War. It's the whole discussion of partial sovereignty of West Germany, all these things that we don't really have time to go into here. But he goes there, and the biggest victory that he claimed, or at least the population said that he managed to achieve, was this agreement to get the last 10,000 prisoners back. It had been decided internally by the Soviet Union they're going to be sent back anyway. But of course, it's great for bargaining, isn't it? And that's exactly what they did. But it's interesting to see the reaction back in West Germany. At that stage, Adenauer in some areas was not very highly regarded for all sorts of reasons. Again, no need to go into this, a different discussion. But when he came back, it's amazing to see how his popularity went through the roof in Germany, because he was the man who brought the prisoners home, which is a bit of a massage story, but there's a very, very famous picture. But in that dates, everybody knew. And should you ever be interested in study post-World War German history, you will see this picture where he comes back from Moscow. And there is this, the woman who basically gets up to him and kisses his hand and falls on her knees. And he just lifts her up and she walks off and all that. And very, very, very strong in the German mind.
No question. I think it's strong in your mind as well, as a member of that community who's been touched by all these. You know, sometimes it, like I say, it almost sounds like it's another world when we talk about these millions and the awful types of suffering. It's still in our lived memory. It's just not always on the surface, but no less important. And that's why we wanted to treat that topic today. And it's a bit of a longer episode today. So thanks for bearing with us through all of it. But we felt that it was really worth taking a chunk of time to deal with. We're not actually done with this topic because one of the other tragic, it just keeps getting tragic, but one of the other tragic aspects of this is what happened to the Soviet prisoners of war when they returned home to the Soviet Union and what their own government and state, for whom they sacrificed so much, did to them afterwards. Matthias and I are going to talk about that, but not here on the regular podcast. We're going to do it in our members forum online. Bothsidesofthewire.com is where you can find that. And we're going to do it in a place that we're calling the War Room. So the War Room is where you can go to get exclusive content from us that won't be on the regular podcast and all sorts of other goodies. You can ask us questions, suggest episode topics, and so on and so forth. You can find that all at bothsidesofthewire.com. I should also add that if you want to test out the War Room and the extra content there for free for 1 month, you can go to bothsidesofthewire.com and then you can enter the code Deep Dark Woods, all one word. So we will either see you in the next episode or see you in the War Room. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
I'm just about to sneeze. It's sitting there. It's not coming out. It's sitting there. So shall we start or not? Yeah, exactly. So probably in the middle of the opening sentence, go, ka-choo!
What are you going to do?
Exactly.